Hi, I'm Andrew Shovlin. I'm Trackside Engineering Director at Mercedes, and we're back to the normal format this week, so I'm here to answer your questions about the Mexican Grand Prix. So, the Mexican Grand Prix, well, it was a difficult race for the team. We saw Valtteri have to migrate to a three-stop strategy, Lewis doing a two-stop. We had a very strong drive by Max Verstappen at the front, and also the Ferrari showed good pace in the race, and that pushed us back to fourth for Lewis, fifth for Valtteri. But that was still enough of a result for Lewis to take his fifth Drivers' Championship, which is a fantastic achievement. So the first question is asking, what was the expected strategy? Well, we obviously do work on Friday. We look at how the tyres behave. We knew the Ultra Soft was going to be a tricky tyre, not as tricky as the Hyper Soft. That was even more difficult to manage. But the Super Soft on Friday performed well. It didn't have the graining that we saw on the other compounds, and the degradation was low. So going into the race, we thought that we would just be able to make a one-stop work. As it happened on Sunday, we had higher degradation. The track conditions were actually making it tougher on the tyres, despite being a bit cooler, and that higher degradation was what triggered us to change strategy and take the additional stops. And our next question is from Margaret on Facebook, asking why was the tyre degradation so high, and also why did we only have used sets to switch onto? Well, the first question, it was because we were seeing graining, which is a mechanism when the surface of the tyre gets damaged and you start to get waves appearing in the rubber, and that results in less grip. And this is what was happening on the front tyres. You could probably see that from the onboard cameras. Now, we weren't the only ones suffering from that, but we were definitely suffering from it worse than Ferrari and Red Bull. And it just causes the car to understeer. You get this loss of grip, and it's very difficult for the drivers to maintain the pace. The second part of the question, why did we only have used sets? Well, sometimes if we don't want to use a harder set of tyres in qualifying, we'll leave it for the race and it's there as a new set. However, the selection here was at the very soft end. We were able to use our ultra soft tyres during qualifying, so we had put laps on those tyres. However, the super soft tyres were new for the race. It was just that once we'd used that super soft, all of the tyres we had to choose from were either used ultra soft or used hyper soft. And the next question's from Lindsay on Twitter, asking about whether it was the altitude of the Mexican track that made life difficult or the tyre selection that had been made by Pirelli. Well, there's two elements to that. One is the altitude is very tough on the cars. The air is very thin, you need to open up the car to get the cooling, but more importantly, the downforce is reduced because the air is a lot less dense. And that means that the car slides around a bit more, it's going a lot faster in a straight line. When you're braking, you haven't got as much downforce and grip. So that is one factor. In terms of the tyre selection, yes, it was an aggressive choice. We were seeing people struggling on both the Hypersoft and the Ultrasoft tyres, but from our point of view as a team, we need to make sure that we're doing as good a job as our close competition. That's Red Bull and that's Ferrari. And in the race, you could see that they were able to manage the tyres a bit better. So we're doing a lot of work back here this week, understanding that we've made some progress on that problem, and hopefully we can avoid a repeat of that particular issue. And we have a question from Kevin on Instagram, asking why we went to a three-stop strategy with Valtteri. Well, you'd seen on the ultra-soft tyre, the one that Valtteri was running actually on his third stint was actually degrading quite badly, and this wasn't a new tyre. This was a tyre he'd run at the start of qualifying. We'd also used that tyre for some laps to the grid. And when he started to suffer the degradation, it was causing a drop in lap time. Now, at that point of the race, there was no one behind Valtteri. We had Hülkenberg, who was almost a lap down to us. So it was actually possible for Valtteri to come in and take the Hypersoft tyre towards the end, which just gave him a bit more grip. It was a bit easy to handle the car, but there was no loss of position. The problem is that the Hypersoft also had a lot of degradation. So we had to wait until we were confident that going to that tyre would give us enough rubber to get to the end of the race from that point. And our next question is asking about whether limiting running in free practice would lead to more interesting racing. Well, actually, we had more or less complete practice sessions in Mexico. If you look back to Austin, we didn't. We lost the Friday running with the rain, so very limited practice there for the drivers, very limited time for the engineers to get the cars set up. And Austin was a good race. It was interesting because people don't know quite how far you can take the tyres. So definitely, on one side, it will lead to less predictable racing if you give the teams less time to understand how far the tyres can go, less time to fine-tune their setup. But generally, teams will try and find ways around this if we restrict it. They'll look at what they can do in simulation, what they can do using models. But certainly in Austin, it probably led to a more interesting race than we may have otherwise had. And Kendall on Instagram is asking about whether you could make a special aero package for the high altitude in Mexico, or whether it's all about mechanical grip. Well, the answer to the first part is yes, you could. The thin air means that you generate less downforce, less drag. And because of that, we're running the wings that we would run around Monaco and Singapore, but we're actually only generating the drag and downforce that we'd have at a track like Monza, where you run much, much smaller wings. So if we had wings that generated more drag and downforce, we would run them in Mexico. But the fact is it's a one-off race, and you've got to be a bit careful how much time you spend developing for these one-off races, because it detracts from your core performance at the other circuits. Now, part two to that question was about mechanical grip. Well, it's a low-speed circuit. All the corners are at low speeds, despite the long straight. And then mechanical grip is important. So it's one where you have to try and optimize the car to generate as much grip as you can. And in this instance, it was how well you were looking at after the tyres that was the big factor there. So the degradation in the race is because the surface of the tyres being damaged, and that means that there's less of the tyre in contact with the road, there's a drop in grip, and that's what leads to the degradation in terms of lap time. And the last question's from Martin on Twitter, asking about when we switched development focus from 2018 to 2019. Well, the first point is it's not really a switch. It's you ramp down the development on the 2018 car and you start ramping up the development on the 2019 car. And by now, the vast majority of everyone's teams are going to be focused on next year's car. But some of those items you've got to start very early. Things like the gearbox, the chassis, suspension positions. That's all work that happens quite early in the season. And by the summer break, historically, most teams would have had the majority of their resource focused on the following year. But even at the last two races, we've had developments on our car. We've seen Red Bull, Ferrari looking at developments of floor. And that might be with a bit of an eye to next year, but it clearly shows that they're still putting some resource on those current cars. So thank you, everybody, for all your questions about the Mexican Grand Prix. We'll be back here in 2 weeks answering questions from the Brazilian Grand Prix.